Hi, I'm John Gonzalez from the University of Michigan, and I'd like to talk to you today about the Michigan Doctoral Experience Study. And this would be a 5-year summary of our study, which has been ongoing since the fall of 2017. In summary, the Michigan Doctoral Experience Study, or MDES as we affectionately call it, is a longitudinal study of the doctoral student experience. And we implemented this study because we really lack data, systematic data across the disciplines on the trajectories and developments of doctoral students. So we went to the literature and tried to create something that was reflective of the current understanding of doctoral student development. And so this number of boxes here represent a part of our theoretical model, but and so I'll walk through kind of what's important here. First is this trajectory from a pre-doctoral student to a postdoctoral scholar. And so this is by nature a longitudinal process that changes over time. And within that process, these boxes represent what's happening. And I tend to think that there's a lot of black boxes that we don't truly understand. Point your attention a bit to some of the bigger boxes, the motivational types being one of those boxes. They're kind of spanning across and that. In psychosocial literature, obviously motivation has been pointed as a factor that influences performance, it influences experience, and so we include that. And then this other large box that's bolded is the disciplinary identity, and that's kind of our outcome variable here, and that we're looking at how doctoral students develop, and rather than just look at completion or how long it took students to complete, we're looking at whether they developed these identity into their discipline and their research, and that's been associated with a number of positive outcomes. So we consider that important. Obviously, within all of this, there's community, there are experiences, there's satisfaction with the meeting of certain psychological needs. There are behaviors, cognitions, and disciplinary effects. There are the effects of the program, the discipline, and the institution. There are financial resources that happen or don't happen across that time, role commitments as parents, as partners that, again, are shifting over time. And all of this obviously intertwined within social identities. So lots of overlaps and correlations, if you will. And so study is designed as a cohort panel study. And so what that means is that we begin with all of the entrants into the doctoral class, and that's about 1,000 students a year. And then every year we resurvey those 1,000 students, or we resurvey all of the ones that are still left at the university. And then we add the new entry cohort. So we grow every year, in that we by adding a new cohort. And so in the 2021 administration, which is the latest, our 5-year administration, we now have 5 cohorts of students. We have at most 5 waves of longitudinal data for the first entrant cohort. And our response rates, there's lots of different response rates we can report, but we usually get between 65 and 70% for the year 1. And obviously there's attrition after that, panel attrition. One interesting thing, and one of the strengths of the cohort study, is that it allows us to pick up some of these cohort effects. So the 2020 cohort is particularly interesting. That cohort started under COVID. And that cohort actually exhibits a number of things that look completely different than all the other cohorts. And one of the things that actually looks completely different is their response rate, which is under 50%. And so an interesting set of circumstances for those students. So with that in mind, I'll just walk through some of the notable findings. And when I showed our theoretical model, one of the things that I pointed to was disciplinary identity, but as a main variable. But something that has emerged over the last 5 years, and that has actually been a big focus of doctoral student both advocacy and research, is well-being and mental health, and we have some questions about this. So I'll start there, because actually I think those are probably some of the most illuminating and interesting findings that we have. So we see a clear decline in well-being. And how do we define well-being? We actually define it as a set of questions about mental health and physical health. And so physical health is on top in this orange box here, orange line. And in that line, you see kind of a steady decline, not as not as steep as the mental health decline. And so we see larger declines in mental health. We see that students begin rating themselves on average at a kind of good or above a very good rating of mental health and well-being. And over time, that falls to kind of not so good, if you will. So it's if you want to put a number on that mental health, it's about 2.7, and there's a lot of variability across that. So we do see a decline in that. It's a decline that is pretty consistent across all cohorts, actually. So I should clarify that I'm using 5 years of data here, and to really eliminate cohort effects, I'm using just one cohort. So this is the 2017 cohort that has the 5 waves of data, but these are consistent across all cohorts. That coincides actually with a very interesting and not surprising change in stress. And so there's a well-documented link in all kinds of literatures about stress and mental health and well-being, and that holds here. So students report feeling more stressed out. Again, very consistent across disciplines and across cohorts. And I'd like to point out what happens at wave 4, which is 2020. It's the apex of COVID for at least for our data and the survey, and that students are coming back to the university after in the midst of a pandemic. There's uncertainty around whether classes will be online, or how campuses are going to handle things like masking and so on. And so there seems to be a lot of stress that is consistent with the pattern, also higher and much steeper than previous years. And then you can see that it comes back down a bit in 2021. So we kind of see this all over in some of these measures, and that COVID and the context of COVID is really changing some of these things. So these are not effects of programs or effects of institutions, they're effects of life, if you will. And so moving on, so we mentioned motivation in the beginning, and we use self-determination theory. And in self-determination, there are these needs that are posited to be essential to sort of happiness and well-being. So there's a need for autonomy, which is just like it sounds like, right? For a doctoral student, that means being able to pursue independent research and independent work. There's a need for feeling competent, and that's a human need to feel like you're capable and able to do things, and knowledgeable, and especially critical for a doctoral student to have that perception of their knowledge, so they can grow into scholars. And then there's a relatedness need, and that's a need for connection and for belonging with other humans and other people that are doing your kind of work. And so we can see, and so these questions ask whether these needs are being met. And you can see we start out in year 1 as kind of, we're meeting needs, right? This is a 5-point scale. And you can see a constant decline over time with these. It's not big, it's not particularly steep, but there is a lower kind of declining pattern with these. I'll move on to something that we're finding very interesting as well, and related perhaps, is the notion of career plan. So we ask a question about what kinds of careers students want to pursue, and then we take this question because it's the one that has really interesting changes over time. So we ask whether students want to pursue tenure track faculty positions, and in year one, you see almost half of the students say yes. And we actually have very few that say no, almost 10%. But over time, this actually kind of starts flip-flopping. And so by the time we get to year four, there's a couple of tick percentages in year five that are not included here, but year four, we're down to 37% are sure that they want to pursue a career in a tenure track faculty position, and 34% are in the unsure category. So that's it's basically very close to being equal. So you'd ask the question, well, are these the same for everyone? And this is one case where disciplinary effects are pretty clear. And so we see here, we have some discipline breakdowns. We have sciences and engineering, the biological and health sciences, the social sciences, and the humanities at the bottom. And you see, I like to point to the humanities as an example where they start out very high in the certainty about wanting to pursue tenure track careers, almost 80%. Or above 80%. And that declines very quickly over time. And certainly by the time we get to year five, actually, we're below 50. By year four, we're about 53%. And then you can see the uncertainty. There's a lot of people unsure. The no's are kind of staying to some degree pretty consistent, but this shows these patterns that often are related to the careers that eventually students pursue. So we know students in engineering are less likely to pursue tenure track faculty careers, and that intention is shown from the very beginning, in that you can see only 40% versus 80%, but you can see declines are pretty consistent across everyone. And so that's something we like to track and monitor, and we're trying to see if it correlates to these other things that we're seeing kind of moving in the same direction. We're also interested in seeing how these early career kind of intentions and potential wants and goals are then related to the kinds of careers that students end up pursuing once they graduate. So we also pointed to advisors, and obviously mentoring is something that is critical for doctoral students. And so this is one area where we actually see pretty stable mentoring ratings. And so this is a mentoring scale from the literature that has these three components about academic advising, career development, and emotional support. And you can see they're sort of, they're maybe, if you fit a kind of regression line, you see a slight downward kind of slope, but for the most part, these are just they're pretty flat with a slight decline, and there's not a lot of differences by gender, by any demographics really. So it's a kind of stable thing. It's not very predictive of much. So an interesting kind of observation is that mentoring and mentor ratings are not particularly sensitive to us, as are some of the other measures. And that's interesting because we might expect that especially changes over well-being might be related to, not receiving the kind of mentoring support that students want, but that's not necessarily being shown in the data. But there is a hint of something else in the next slide. And so we take these mentoring questions and then we ask a different question. We have a question of, hey, do you have a written plan, or have you had a conversation about mentoring with your advisor or mentor? And that question turns out to be a little more predictive. So forgive the size of my lines here. I was trying to squeeze a lot into this slide. But what's worth pointing out is that usually this blue bottom line, for the most part, this blue line represents people who did not have a mentoring conversation, did not have any engagement about mentoring with their mentor in the first year. orange kind of line represents, in this case, the second line in the first graph represents people who had a discussion but didn't have a written mentoring plan. And then the third is the people who had a discussion and a written mentoring plan. So what we see most of the time is that this blue line not having a conversation seems to be a proxy for something. So it predicts lower mental health. It predicts high stress, a little, at least a bit of a start in and increasing stress. It predicts a lower autonomy and competence and relatedness. Needs being met. So there's perhaps something about this engagement with the mentors early on that tells us something about the mentoring experience. We're not quite sure yet, but something worth thinking about. And lastly, I did mention that we have a cohort study. So one of the things that allows us to do is to kind of observe how these cohorts are different. And this became very apparent, obviously, with students that started under the stress of a pandemic with them. And so here we're showing just kind of how 2020 cohort differs from the other cohorts, or it's the same. And there's things to point out. One, you might not be very surprised at all that in well-being, these students started at a higher level of stress and a lower level of physical and mental health than their previous cohorts. You can see there's some cohort effects here. You can see these numbers are slightly different, but 2020 cohort is particularly different than all the other ones, and that's not surprising. You can see some of these other things like motivation; they're very similar, right? Identity is something that's weirdly changing over time. So this is how students feel kind of connected to their discipline. The psychosocial development in terms of efficacy, a little lower. So there are some kind of different baselines here. So these are all really baselines for these cohorts, but really worth pointing out that these students are starting out at a different set of places, and that's important because, and this is a little bit of a plug for my paper, for our paper that we recently published and that I'll link to in the next slide. We have found that these baselines are really critical of development. So in this paper we wrote, we use a trajectory-based modeling called group-based trajectory modeling to try to kind of profile our participants into different categories. And what that model says is basically that we have these kinds of profiles of development over time for our doctoral students. And this is that singular cohort again. So we'll try to add more cohorts to that soon. But what we see is a kind of student in this first group, and that constitutes 20% of our population, that start out at a low point and then struggle. And so that seems to be a group that is affected by their baseline. There's also a group that starts out just a little higher on average, but experiences a rapid decline, and that's about 14%. So about 35% of students are have lower starting baselines and are declining more rapidly. So that would suggest in our view that there's kind of an at-risk student in terms of mental health, in terms of physical health, and in terms of stress, and that these things are perhaps associated with that these baselines are perhaps predictive of the trajectories. And so that's important because then the COVID cohort students, the students that start under the pandemic, they might be at more risk given that the ratings are lower. So these are some of the trajectories, and I invite you to look at the paper closely if you are interested in sort of learning our approach for this. But it suggests that there's these kinds of profiles of development, and the striking thing for us is that a lot of these are declining groups. There isn't a group that's really thriving. There's a 3% group that's thriving for now because they started up very high. They haven't declined much, but there's not a lot of growth in these areas. And so just to clarify, this is mental health, physical health, and identity development. So again, with that in mind, I'll point to some deeper reading, a couple of papers we've written about this, a couple of presentations, some plugs for the work of our research group here. We have some more work in the pipeline about a full exposition of the effect of COVID using comparison cohorts, and then a theoretical paper about our theoretical framework that's in the works. Very much appreciate your attendance and your attention, and please reach out with any questions, any comments to chat about this work. We're very excited about what's happening and the potential for this to really help us think about the development of doctoral students across time and different and